At the Finance and Responsible Governance Committee meeting at City Hall on March 1st, Hemson Consulting gave an overview to the Council of their ongoing study plan in light of Bill 23. On November 28 last year, the Ontario government's Bill 23, officially known as the More Homes Built Faster Act 2022, received royal assent. It amended the Development Charges Act, the Planning Act, and a number of other legislations. Development charges imposed on new developments are a major source of revenue for the city and are intended to fund repair, replacement, and operating expenditures related to the city's assets. Bill 23's update to the development charges regime introduces new exemptions and discounts for affordable and attainable housing. The discounts are based on the number of bedrooms. Bill 23 will severely limit city's ability to raise funds. The City of Barrie hired Hemson Consulting to explore ways to generate revenue. Hemson Consulting is carrying out a multi-study process that includes a development charges, background study and bylaw, a community benefits charges bylaw, and the Parkland dedication bylaw in order to allow the city to continue to collect this revenue in the future. The final report will be presented to the Council in the spring season.
Presentations concerning the development charges study, community benefits charges strategy, parkland dedication, cash in lieu, and related bylaws being presented by Hemson Consulting Limited. I would like to now call upon Craig Miller, our Chief Financial Officer, to introduce the presentation.
Thank you, Chairman Harvey. So Jackie Hall from Hemson Consulting. So we'll ask her to come on down. The point of this presentation is more of a development charge CBC Parkland 101. It's an informal education session, and as Jackie will speak to, we are working on the formal update to the background study, and which will be coming forward in the spring. So again, this is Jackie's really here to talk, just to sort of give a 101 on the overall topic.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be before the committee this afternoon, especially the first time I understand that this committee is meeting. So with that, we do have a presentation that we'd like to pull up on the screen if that's possible. So over the next 15 to 20 minutes, what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the process that we're currently undertaking as the city's consultants, the legislative framework that we're working within under the context of Bill 23, which amended not only the Development Charges Act, but also the Planning Act and a whole host of other legislation as well. We're going to review the project deliverables that we're bringing forward as part of this multi-study process, and then also talk about the objectives that we've achieved to date, and also a little bit about our project timelines, next steps, and how we will be moving forward. So our firm's been retained to undertake 3 separate but related studies. So the first being a development charges background study and bylaw, which many of you might have heard of before. And so what that is intended to do is fund the growth related capital costs related to future development. The second study process that we are undertaking is implementing a community benefits charges bylaw, which will be the city's first bylaw under the Planning Act. And I'll get into these studies a little bit more in the subsequent slides, but I just wanted to provide a bit of an overview so we have that context as I move forward through the presentation. The third and final study that we're looking at is the Parkland dedication bylaw, and that's going to be informed by a parks master plan that is currently being undertaken by another consultant, GSP. And our goal through these studies is to pass new DC, CBC, and Parkland bylaws in order to allow the city to continue to collect this revenue in the future. So just a little bit of context to what development charges are. They are imposed, as I mentioned, on new development, and it's intended to fund the growth related capital costs. So we can't use it to fund any sort of repair, replacement, or operating expenditures related to the city's assets. It's intended to pay for new infrastructure, as I mentioned, and also maintain existing service levels. And the underlying principle is that growth should pay for growth. So therefore, the existing taxpayers of the city should not be required to pay for new infrastructure that's required of new development. To put it into context, as I mentioned, so the reason why we're doing the 3 studies at the same time is that we're really working within this new framework of what we're calling funding for growth-related capital. And this allows us to not only look at opportunities to review and align how the capital projects are being funded through these 3 different mechanisms. So the DCs, Community Benefits Charges, as I'll refer to them as CBCs, and also Parkland acquisition or Parkland dedication. So for example, recognizing one of the reasons why we're doing these studies at the same time is that recent changes to the Development Charges Act now limits the services for which we can collect. But however, the introduction of community benefits charges does allow us more flexibility. So we're looking at how we can use these 3 revenue sources in tandem in order to make sure that we're recovering the most appropriate amount of money for the city in the future. I mentioned or alluded to Bill 23 and the legislative changes that were brought forward as part of that piece, as part of that act that received royal assent on November 28th. And it really did change the way in which we calculate and collect for development charges. A few minor administrative changes to community benefits charges and also Parkland dedication. So one of the important considerations that we're looking at as part of this update, particularly on the DC side, is that now we have new exemptions and discounts for affordable housing, attainable housing. Those regulations have not been formalized yet, but if they do become formalized through this process, we'll be looking at that as well. Exemptions are also being introduced, or discounts rather, for rental housing, and it's based on the number of bedrooms. So that has now must be statutorily applied through the development charges regime. There's also now a mandatory 5-year phase-in of the rate. So in year 1, we only are allowed to collect for 80% of our calculated development charges, and they are phased in over a period of 5 years, meaning in year 5, we're collecting 100% of what we calculate through this background study. On the Parkland dedication side, there's also been some new exemptions that have been introduced. There's a reduction in the alternative rate. In effect, essentially what's happened is there's been caps or limitations that have been placed on what we can collect. And there's also now the ability to convey encumbered parkland. So the background study is a very prescribed process in Ontario, and it requires us to do quite a bit of work. So it starts with the development of a growth forecast where we look at the anticipated amount of growth in the city, where it is going to occur, and the type. We then work with staff to come up with our capital program. So what infrastructure is then necessitated by that development? We're limited, and I apologize, on the slide it says 10-year historic service levels. Bill 23 did change that. We're now looking at a 15-year historic service level, and that effectively caps what we can recover for through the development charges for certain services. Our capital needs are then subject to a whole host of different reductions and adjustments that we have to make. So for example, if we're expecting any sort of grants or contributions, we have to net that off. We can't recover for that share. If there's a benefit provided to the existing residents in the city, we have to make sure that that share is omitted from the calculation as well. Any sort of available DC reserves, we do apply that to our calculation, and that's reduced from what we can recover. As well, we give consideration to any sort of oversizing of infrastructure that will benefit development beyond the identified planning horizon. What we do once we make all of those adjustments, we've gone through all these steps, we then have our DC recoverable share. And that is what we then apportion between 2 sectors. The residential side is done on a per unit basis based on the occupancy of the different dwelling units. We have different rates for a single detached home versus an apartment, for example. And then we have a non-residential charge, which is based on or levied on a square meter of gross floor area. I just wanted to speak to the committee about the development forecast assumptions, recognizing that there are a few forecast numbers that are being used right now by the city. So for the purposes of our development charge background study, we are using largely the assumptions that were applied in the 2019 and 2021 studies. The reason being is that those align with the city's current master plans and infrastructure needs that have been identified for the 2031 and 2041 population and employment numbers. And so recognizing that the staff are going through the process right now of updating these master plans to the 2051 planning horizon. In subsequent DC study updates, you'll likely see us talking about 2051 numbers, the population and employment that's associated with that, but we'll also be bringing forward the infrastructure needs that are necessitated by that growth as well. And because we don't have that we're referring to, or we are using our 2031 and 2041 estimates. So this slide, and I know there's a lot on here, but what I would like to try to get across is what development charges are used to fund in the city as they stand today. And the pie chart on the screen here provides a sample of the residential development charges. And so not unlike what we see virtually in every municipality, engineering services, which represents roads, water, wastewater, they take up the lion's share of what we are able to fund through development charges. And that's a function of the nature of those services, recognizing that they are quite costly and that they, the magnitude of those capital programs and the amount that we are able to fund through the DCs are much more significant when we look at, say, other services such as library or protection services, public works. Not to say that those services aren't important, but because of the prescribed process that we have to go to or go through the study process, this is how the calculation typically shakes out. We see a much higher allocation to engineered services than we do to the general services. As part of the DC background study process, there's a few decision points that council has to make or consider as part of that process. So the development related capital programs, once they're finalized, we bring those forward for approval as part of the background study. Consideration for what we refer to, or what the legislation refers to as area rating or area specific charges. So right now, the way that the city's charges are currently structured is that we have them within the former boundary and then Salem and Hewitt's, and we're proposing to bring forward that structure as part of this update. And then there's also consideration that can be given to whether or not to hold another public meeting. Statutorily, we're required to hold one. Council can make the decision to hold another one if they feel it's necessary. It's not often used, but it is there. Implementation, of course, we have been retained to calculate the maximum permissible rates under the legislation, but council can make decisions as to whether or not full or partial rates should be implemented. Just as a reminder, though, in the context of Bill 23, there is now a mandatory phase-in of the rates, so that's applied. And there are also now several exemptions that are also applied as of right. Moving on to the Community Benefits Charges, or CBCs. This is a tool that is replacing Section 37, or heightened density bonusing, under the Planning Act. The idea is that it's only able to be levied against high density development. So the definition as outlined in the Planning Act is that a building, in order to be charged CBCs, has to be 5 or more stories and have 10 or more residential units. So both of those have to be achieved. The regulation also caps the amount that we can recover, and that's set at 4% of the land value the day before the building permit is issued. So that's reflective of all the planning permissions for that particular development, and that's what that's intended to reflect. So what can we fund through CBCs? Well, really any sort of growth related capital costs. It's very similar to a development charges study exercise. We can include things such as parking, which was previously DC eligible and is no longer eligible, studies, parkland development, active transportation. We can also charge for eligible DC services, but we can't double dip, meaning we can't include the same project in the DC background study as the CBC study and recover those same costs. We do have to do a nexus test, which relates to those eligible developments, or I was mentioning on the previous slide. So the servicing needs, those capital costs that we include, and those qualifying developments, 5 or more stories, 10 or more residential units, that's the nexus that we have to achieve. And so recognizing that, also coupled with the 4% cap, this is a fairly limited revenue source. It's not applied to all developments in the city. It's only scoped to those, and I'm sorry to belabor the point, but 5 or more stories, 10 or more residential units. This is a schematic of the study process, very similar to the DC process. Really what we do is we look at our development forecast, identify our capital needs. We make the necessary adjustments for any sort of grants, subsidies, other recoveries, any benefit to the existing residents that shouldn't be borne by growth. That gives us our eligible share. And then we come up with an estimate or revenue that could be applied to the qualifying developments. However, recognizing once again that they're limited, we aren't necessarily required to bring forward a calculated rate. What we can do is meet the threshold of hitting that 4% of land value cap, and then the 4% of land value maximum can be applied to all developments that come forward. In terms of the implementation and administration, consultation is required but not defined. We are recommending that a formal public meeting be held, and I believe we're suggesting that it be held in tandem with the DC study process. Only one CBC bylaw can be allowed. We can't have multiple bylaws. There is a requirement to do a notice of passage, and there's also a right to appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal, once again, not dissimilar to our DC regime. From an administration and reporting perspective, we have to establish separate reserve funds or a special reserve for CBCs. In each calendar year, we have to spend or allocate at least 60% of those monies. The city has to have a list of at least 3 appraisers under agreement, and that list must be maintained. And there has to be an annual report similar to the annual treasurer's statement with development charges that show the opening and closing balances on that special account. Through our work to date, we have identified preliminary project types or groupings that we are proposing to bring forward as part of the CBC process. This includes the cost of actually doing the CBC update, master plans and studies, parking, parks projects that aren't double counted with the development charges, housing, as that's no longer an eligible DC service, climate initiatives, public art, and if there are service level increases above and beyond what we're permitted to recover through the DCs, we are able to look at them through the CBC process. The last and final study that we're working on for the city right now is the Parkland acquisition. And so the Planning Act permits municipalities to require land as or equivalent in cash in lieu as a condition of Section 42 or development, redevelopment, subdivision, and consents. There is also, as part of the Parkland dedication bylaw, or in order to levy those rates, there is a requirement to have a policy in the official plan, which the city already has. There's also a requirement to have a parks plan that examines the need for parkland. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that's being completed right now by another consultant. Bill 23 has now further limited the alternative parkland dedication rates that we can apply. So we can charge for up to 1 hectare per every 600 residents, or up to 1 hectare per every 1,000 residents. And it's capped at 10% of the size if it's under 5 hectares, or 15% of the size if it's over 5. And for land dedication, there's the standard of 2% of the net site for commercial and industrial uses, and 5% of the net site area for all others. The city did pass an interim parkland dedication bylaw, similar to many other municipalities, in order to make sure that we hit those requirements that were introduced under Bill 23. And so essentially at this point in time, the city is now subject to those rules that were enacted and is recovering for the maximum permissible rates under the Parkland Planning Act requirements. And so as part of this update, we'll just be looking to do a refresh of that bylaw and making sure that those objectives are continuing to be met. In terms of what we've done to date, we've done some really good work on coming up with our draft development forecast and looking at those 2031 and 2041 numbers. We've been drafting historical inventories and funding envelopes and developing preliminary capital programs. On the CBC front, the development forecast has also been examined. And we've started to look at those potential projects. We've also had some a fair number of consultation sessions with the development industry. At the end of January, we held 3 technical sessions with representatives from the Salem and Hewitt's landowners. We held 2 other sessions earlier this week, or Monday and yesterday. And then we're actually going to have 1 more on Monday next week as well. So we've been having lots of dialogue and consultation. Just moving forward to next steps. We are looking to have the CBC and DC background study released at the end of April. And we'll be having further consultation with the broader industry group in early May. We'll then hold our public meeting in mid-May to allow for that input on the 3 studies that we're bringing forward. The bylaws that will be proposed will be brought forward to General Committee on June 14th, with the idea of having the bylaws passed for June 21st. So with that, that concludes my formal presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee or others have.
Great. Thank you for your presentation. Do any members of committee have any questions? Mayor Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Ms. Hall. And I just wanted to go through quite a number of things in the presentation. I guess my first question would be, at the end of this process on June the 21st, will we as a council be passing a bylaw where growth pays for growth?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. That's an excellent question, Mr. Mayor. So we will be passing a bylaw that allows growth to pay for growth under the maximum permissions of the legislation. So recognizing that we do have all these statutory discounts and exemptions, those are applied automatically when development comes through the door and when they actually pay their DCs. But our job as your consultant is to bring you a bylaw with those maximum rates, and then there's decisions that can be made around that as to whether or not other exemptions or discounts should be examined.
Thank you. If I can drill down into the numbers a little bit, and obviously this is getting ahead of the report, and so I understand it's a little bit backwards, but I think it's important for members of council to see what, to envision what we're going to see back here, because it informs all of our decision making, whether it's a capital project or capital projects that draw some sort of operating cost for us down the road. So it used to be that was 90% was essentially paid for through DCs based on a 10-year moving piece of prior costs. That's now moved to 15 years. Is that correct?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Okay. So if we were at, just before we get there, so if we were at 90% and then we essentially have a 10% reduction for the next 10 years, essentially, that would mean that 81% of the costs would be growth would actually be able to be costed out and then charged for. But after we move it to the 15%, has there been any sort of guesstimate put together as to what the effect of that is?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. So as part of this exercise, we haven't done a formal dive as to what the city's current DC regime would essentially miss out on in terms of the Bill 23 changes. But as part of our exercise that we're going through this update, we'll actually be able to cost out and say, based on the 5-year phase in, this is what we would expect would be the anticipated revenue loss based on the exemptions for rental housing, for example. We can also put a number to that as well. So that's what we'll be doing through that exercise.
As well as the 15-year horizon instead of a 10-year horizon.
Correct, through you, Mr. Chair. To clarify, so the 15-year is about the historical inventories and the funding envelopes that arise from that calculation. Yes, we can identify what the delta or the difference would be using the 10-year versus the 15. Absolutely.
And am I correct in guessing that if we extend further backwards, the average goes down, not up, in the sense that the recoverables go down, not up?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. For many of the services, we do see that, and some examples we have actually seen it increase, and that's just a function of whether or not a municipality is continuing to build assets. They have a declining service level, then we run into issues. So sometimes the 15-year service level does assist, but I wouldn't expect that for the city. Okay.
So at the end of the day, what we're looking at in terms of 90%, and then once you take the 10% off from Bill 23, which is just an average number, and I get that's not going to be exact. We get down to 81, but we go to a 15-year horizon. It's going to go drop more. Let's say somewhere it's going to be in the mid 70% recoverable. And at the same time, we have inflation that's obviously hitting us very, very, very hard. How often do we get to increase our DCs based on inflationary pressures that we're seeing right now?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. That's an excellent question. So there is a regime in which municipalities are able to apply what we call a DC index factor. It's set out in the bylaw and is actually prescribed through the legislation as well. So As part of the changes introduced through Bill 23, there are now considerations that are given to also examination for maximum interest payments that can be made for DCs that are deferred. So as part of the bylaw and the information that we bring forward, we'll actually set out when the DCs are proposed to be indexed. And then there's some other policies as well that relate to how we collect interest on development charges that are deferred, which are statutorily required through the legislation, and that policy can be external to the bylaw, but it's also now set out and prescribed through the legislation as well.
Okay. So if we move past the actual DC itself to the benefit, the community benefit charge, the 4%, you know, and I don't know if I'm reading this correctly or not, so I'm looking for an affirmation or correction if you can. I buy a piece of property. Let's say I buy it for $1 million, and I go through the process of getting it rezoned, and at that point there'd be some sort of appraisal done or agreed upon value of the land between the developer and the city. Is that correct?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. That's a great question. And so there's a whole host of rules around how the appraisals work. There is a 4% land value estimate that we'll bring forward as part of the CBC strategy. And that's essentially what we use for the purposes of looking and examining the cap. Now, there are mechanisms for a developer to dispute that, and there's rules around how much that's done. That's why, as part of the requirements, the municipality has to maintain that list of appraisers. So there's specific rules that are set out in terms of how that's done.
But what point is that appraisal done?
Sorry, the appraisals are done, I believe, at the the land value is based on the day the permit is. The day before the building permit is pulled, which is intended to reflect those zoning and planning changes. And I believe that the appraisal is brought forward at that time as well.
Okay. So it's not, I mean, this doesn't seem to be a huge contributor monetarily to the overall picture. And obviously, you know, you take every dollar you can get, but to give an example, you know, we have a $10 million piece, you know, buy $1 million piece of property, it gets 100 stories approved on it. Now it's worth $10 million. And at the end of the day, there's going to be hundreds of units there, and there's going to be a $400,000 contribution. It is that, I know I'm using just very, very inaccurate numbers, but the 400,000 on the 10 million is correct.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think that the picture you're painting is quite accurate in terms of CBCs are very limited in what they can recover, and we're not expecting a lot of revenue for the city from it. We've done some very, very rough back of the envelope calculations, and we're looking at anywhere from 5 to 10 million over 10 years. So that's really not a lot of money when we're looking at the magnitude of your capital program. And so, yes, that is a correct picture you're painting, I would say.
At 5 million, I'm not sure it's worth the staff cost to even do it. I'm not being facetious when I say that, but I'd love to see the report on that. So we've now, let's say, covered up a tiny bit. 1% may be made up of our 25% we're behind through these CBCs, and we go to the Parkland dedication. And the Parkland dedication, what is your projection, guesstimated projection? Because you're going to come back with something far more accurate than today. What is your guesstimated projection on Parkland dedication fees that will be collected versus Parkland that will be received by the city?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. That's a very, very good question. And unfortunately, we're just not at the point in the study process to even really give you a ballpark. Once we get information from GSP, who's working on the Parks Master Plan, and we're able to model some of that, we'll have a better sense of what we can expect. Okay.
Mr. Chair, if it's okay to maybe make a little bit of a statement before others go on. You know, these studies come forward, and I think we need to be very, very conscious of what we're seeing, because what I'm hearing and what I was seeing in this report is like the best case scenario is 3/4 of the dollars of the costs associated with growth can be recouped. There's you know, maybe it's 79%, maybe it's 70%, but let's just guesstimate it's 75%. And the reality of that conversation is that the other 25% comes from somewhere, right? And if you look through our budget and our business plan, I said this during the budget, you'll see that there's tax capital contributions to growth projects. And, you know, the argument is, well, that road need, you know, those 2-lane road that's turning into a 6-lane road, those 2 lanes needed to be, you know, brought up to snuff at some point. I don't buy the argument. I think that we have to be very conscious going forward as to when this report comes back, as to what the actual costs are. And if everything aligns and we're at the best possible outcome, we're still only going to be 75% of the way there. And that's what's driving higher budgets in the city of Barrie. And if you don't believe that, you just have to look at the budget to see the contributions from one to the other. I'll leave it there, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Nuttall. Any other members of committee with questions? Councillor Congal.
Thank you, Chair Harvey, and thank you for the presentation, Ms. Hall. I do have a couple of questions. I guess I'll start in the reverse order. So at the end of the slide, you talked a little bit about the consultations and knowing some of those were really just within days. Can you share anything to date about the framing of those conversations, or if they were specific based on the audience to date, and if there's anything we can appreciate about the dialogue happening with those stakeholders?
Yes, absolutely. And through you, Mr. Chair. So the consultations that we have have had to date have been very technical in nature. So it's looking at the unit costs related to the master plans for engineered services, making sure that the industry and their representatives and their consultants have an understanding of the costs that will underpin and support the capital program that we're bringing forward for the purposes of the DC rate calculation. We've had discussions with them in terms of those funding envelopes, those historical inventories, and what makes up the funding envelope calculations that we're proposing to bring forward. And I think by and large, we've had some really good dialogue and discussion. Staff have done an excellent job of getting information to the industry to help answer their questions that they've brought forward. And our hope is that through this process, it will allow us to have a smoother implementation of the bylaw.
Thank you for that. And the other question I had, and I'll refer it to you or Mr. Miller, if it's more appropriate, was more about slide 13 and the reference to spending or allocating at least 60% of monies in the special account. Could you speak to what allocating means around the scope of that? Does it still have to be spent within that calendar year that's referenced around kind of the auditing of what's in the account at the beginning and end? So is there anything there that we should appreciate around how dollars would be allocated or attributed to expenses?
So through you, Chairman Harvey, I'll take a stab at that one. So for the CBC, it's more or less saying you have to allocate 60% of it. So in our capital planning process, we'll more than allocate 60% of it in that time. It's making sure you have the project. I guess the concept is they don't want you sitting on money and you don't collect money you're not going to use. But for this particular revenue sources, as Jackie indicated, it's not going to be huge dollars for the city, and we have more, as council knows, there's more needs than money, so we will have no issue allocating it. They're not saying you have to spend it in 1 year. It's you need to allocate it, and we will certainly allocate that.
That's great. Thank you. That was my assumption about carryover was possible. And then my last one was, is there any more information you can provide around big picture qualifying developments? So when we talk about qualifying developments, is there any history? So often when we're talking about, what's to come around the development charges and new bylaws, and then Bill 23, but then how far back does it extend? So is there anything we should appreciate around how developments will qualify and how far back that goes? So is there a re-qualification, re-review, or is it from a particular point in time forward?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's an excellent question. And so essentially what happens is that there are different points of collection and determination for development charges and CBCs. Once a DC has been determined and collected, and if we pass a new bylaw, any future developments that get brought forward, they would then be subject to the new bylaw as long as we have repealed and replaced what was previously in force. There's some nuances there with the way the DC structure currently exists. Developers now can actually freeze at a point in time, so they can submit an application. And then if they're planning, if the term lapses, then we can apply the new bylaw rates. But staff have mechanisms in order to track that. So by and large, a development that is coming forward will be paying the new DC bylaw rates and the CBC rates. There are a few that end up straddling the bylaw just in terms of the timing of when they submitted their applications, but the majority going forward will absolutely be subject. There's no retroactivity that we're allowed to apply with the new bylaw.
And perhaps last then question specific to that is there a timeline on the freeze around what's the window, and can they continue to reapply over time within a certain window? So is that a rolling process, or is it kind of like an opportunity only once that they get from a freeze standpoint, and then they're just subject to the conditions of the bylaw at the time?
Sure. Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes. So there's specific legislated timelines that are identified for the DC freeze. And so I unfortunately don't have it in front of me at this point in time. But I believe if they come in for their site plan agreement and then they don't pull a permit in 2 years, you're then able to apply the new DC rate. So it's around the 2-year mark if it lapses. So there is that mechanism. So it's not sitting there forever, in other words.
Thanks, Ms. Hall. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other members of committee with any questions? Deputy Mayor Thompson.
Thank you, Chair Harvey. Thanks for the presentation, Ms. Hall. Really quick on slide 5, if I heard you correctly, the purpose of doing all 3 studies is to maximize what we can get. So it's not piecemeal. It's trying to, to Mayor Nuttall's point, right now we're hovering around 70 and we're trying to get all 3 to merge to get us, the greatest percentage of recoverables. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's definitely one of the advantages to doing these studies in tandem, is making sure that we are able to maximize the cost recovery through those limitations.
And one final question, you made a comment about appeal. So like the DC, developers can appeal all 3 of these studies as well?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Any members not part of committee? Councilor Morales.
Thank you, Chair Harvey. Ms. Hall, great presentation on this extremely important stuff. So I'm going to go back to something that Mayor Nuttall touched on. So Hemson and yourself and everybody associated, you guys have more or less the mandate to get as close to his growth pace for growth within the confines of the new legislation. Okay. So do you also have the mandate to produce a plan, a schedule that will maximize that will maximize the number of units that are built in the city of Barrie in the future? Because I wonder how those two coincide.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. That is a bit of a complicated question, but the answer is we don't have a direct ability to influence the number of units that are constructed. The way in which we develop and bring forward our calculation, we identify the growth potential of the city, and then we also identify the infrastructure that's necessitated to service that development. And so we use those 2 factors in our calculation. Now, if growth doesn't occur at the pace that it was originally anticipated to occur, what typically ends up happening is that there's a corresponding deferral of capital. And so you're not collecting DCs at the rate that we would have originally anticipated, but you're also therefore not going to likely build infrastructure at the same pace. Of course, that's a very high level a theoretical approach to it. And there are, of course, projects that have to be built in advance of growth occurring, but there's mechanisms through the DC calculation that I could spend several hours talking about in order to recover those costs. So essentially, yes, we do maximize the DCs for the purposes of bringing forward a calculation. And we look at the growth that's related to the infrastructure that we are bringing forward as part of the study.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Harvey. The reason I asked that question is this: I see a different perspective, and please correct me if I'm getting it wrong. But you're essentially creating a schedule. Okay, this is where your DC should be. This is where your community benefit charge. I hate acronyms, so it's replacing essentially bonusing. And I like the word bonusing because it's a very accurate word. This isn't something we should be like thinking it should be a revenue stream. This is when projects go way and beyond VOP density. So I agree, it's a very small amount, and it's there for specific reasons for strategic projects, or just if council has the will to go up and beyond its OP mandated density. So if you have the mandate to maximize getting money for the city from DCs and other fees, and we want to make sure there's just more housing because we're in a housing shortage in Barrie and all across the province. You said that they're a little bit different. The way I see it, and I think you had a great slide on this, it's considered the area rating. And the area rating, how I see it is not all growth is equal. So what I mean by that is I've got a lot of the annex land. So if I have a road in my ward and it's 700 kilometer, for math purposes, it's a kilometer, and I have 40 single detached homes along it, that is not as sustainable of growth as a project I have in my ward, active file, where there's 4 homes right now, end of life homes, and it's being replaced by a mid-rise that's going to be somewhere between 8 to 11 stories on an existing stretch of Yonge. So not all growth is equal is what I'm getting at. So here's the question, could Hemson, shouldn't we implement an area rating that incentivizes growth in areas where it's more sustainable and cost effective, and create a disincentive for growth? And the way you do it is just charging higher fees in the form of higher fees in areas or for density levels where the growth isn't sustainable.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. There's a couple of things in there that I just want to parse out. So the first being just the comment about bonusing and community benefits charges. It's no longer related to bonusing, and it's quite distinct in the legislation. It is just applied to higher density developments that meet that threshold of 5 or more stories or 10 or more residential units. So most of the time, or not most of the time, I should say, but those types of buildings can be permitted as of right within a municipality zoning bylaw. So there isn't that density issue. Your comment though about area rating, and we get asked this quite a lot, so it's a fair question for sure. And so there's a couple of things I'd like to point out. So the city actually does employ or use area rating, area specific development charges in its current regime. We're bringing that forward as part of this update as well, but it's for larger benefiting areas. It's for the former municipal boundary and then the Salem and Hewitt secondary plan areas, recognizing those are greenfield developments. They have unique infrastructure needs for certain services, and therefore we feel it is appropriate that they have defined benefit and therefore should be recovered on that basis. The challenge with doing specific area rating and trying to incent development through area rating is that the math actually doesn't support doing that. And so basically what ends up happening is, say, if you were to draw a boundary around one area, but you have less development, but you have a certain amount of infrastructure needs, oftentimes what we see is, one, the infrastructure is actually being used by a larger area. So therefore we can't draw that boundary as per the legislation. We have to make sure that there is a direct benefit to the development that is being brought forward. Second of all, if we actually had, let's say, hundreds of different area rating calculations, it would actually, in some respects, come out in the wash because we're using, certain drivers for our service level standards. So, for example, libraries, it's not typically seen on an area rating basis. There's very few municipalities that do it, recognizing that it's really driven by citywide or municipal-wide population growth, and that individuals are able to access any library across the city. So it's a bit of a complicated question. In order to say incent development and achieve affordable housing objectives, there's a couple things that are happening through the Development Charges Act. One being is that we now have new discounts and exemptions specifically targeted at affordable housing. There's a whole host of exemptions that are going to come forward through the legislation, but it hasn't been defined in the regulations at this time. And so once that regulation comes forward, we expect that there will be DC and CBC exemptions for affordable housing, affordable and attainable housing. I mentioned in the presentation as well that rental housing developments, they automatically receive a discount. It's structured based on the number of bedrooms, and that's applied to every municipality now.
What's rental?
A rental?
Oh, rental. I'm sorry, I thought you said
Sorry.
Yeah. Now, through Chair Harvey, is there a way to create, without delving into area ratings, thank you for that explanation, without going down that road, creating a, basically, there's lots of developments. I don't want to pick a specific address, but there's one in our downtown core. Building's now up, it's done. They just wanted an office, a small like office for the business. They didn't want to get density, they didn't want to get towers. And it's along one of our main roads in the downtown, where we envision towers and towers and towers, and it's, I think, 3 stories. Because they weren't in the objective of creating residential for the land. They wanted an office for a small business. There I drive by it, I see an opportunity. I said 3 stories, all these buildings are going to be 15 plus, maybe even 40. And are you able to, is Hemson able to create a DC bylaw where if somebody falls way below the intended density targets in the OP, they're essentially paying extra? Because it's essentially wasting the land, where we could be getting 250 units and now we're getting 3. That almost happened in Ward 9 actually, where it was a proposal right there, that building that I talked about. Next door, there's an identical building, it's 7 stories and it has 256 units, and it almost came to council with like 40 towns. So the tax bills on 40 towns, $5,000 ish, or $4,000 times 50 versus 250. While I understand they pay a little bit less, we ended up benefiting. We got a good form of density. So could you create not a penalty, but a disincentive through your DC structure that would encourage the private sector to maximize their density as identified in our OP?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I appreciate the comment, and if I could summarize, it's essentially that in some instances we're seeing developments that are being brought forward that aren't achieving what their planning permissions could be under the zoning bylaw. And so unfortunately, I would suggest that the development charges are not the appropriate regime to do that. The DCs are levied on development charges, sorry, the acronyms. The development charges are levied on the proposed number of units and GFA in a given application. It doesn't distinguish between what the zoning is on that site. There's no ties to the zoning bylaw or the official plan. It is strictly based on what the application is bringing forward and what is being allowed to be built through the building permit.
So it would be a development charge mechanism that you
That's correct. Yes.
That you encourage to do this. Okay. And then just final, thank you for the time allocation, Chair Harvey. I got this comment from a planning consultant a couple months ago, and I'll just say the comment out loud because I know there's lots of concerns. There's lots of unknowns. For example, when Bill 23 was first announced, I thought from what I read that we had to spend 60% of our DCs every year. Now it turns out, no, it's 60% of your community benefits charge, which is a way different reality. So as we get more fleshing out information with the planning consultants, now take it with a grain of salt. I'm hearing this from a planning consultant from the private sector, said cities worried about the reduction in revenues from DCs are misguided. The DCs you're worried about not getting were from units that were never going to be built because it wasn't feasible to build them prior to Bill 23. Do you have any comments through yourself, Chair Harvey, on that?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. So, and maybe I should just clarify as well, the Development Charges Act does require us now to allocate or spend 60% of the engineer reserves. But basically every municipality does that because of the nature of that capital program, just the magnitude of the project. So that's not an issue I foresee for the city on the DC front. The comment about, whether or not municipalities are actually losing DC revenue and that it's related to, growth that might not have materialized in a non-Bill 23 world. I think that is a challenging comment to respond to, just recognizing that the DCs are a framework that allows us to recover for growth-related capital based on our identified population and employment targets and the capital infrastructure that is needed to service that development. So if there is a direct correlation and changes to total population or total employment, there's a direct correlation to the changes in the capital program as well. And so changes in growth and the quantum of growth doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, have a correlation to this notion of DC revenue being foregone. It's a mechanism of things being adjusted. And I think that there's just, if I can understand your comment correctly, or if I'm summarizing correctly, the comment is about the additional houses that are now going to be built under Bill 23 because there's legislative permissions that are happening. Is that correct?
It's the additional units specifically to areas in Bill 23 where they're being discounted. So you're not getting them in single attached homes. You're getting them, again, let's go back to that project in my ward where maybe instead of 10 floors, you're now getting 13 floors. Okay. You're getting 20% off, maybe if that's where they decide to go, which I don't know. But they were never going to build those floors anyways.
Right. And through you, Mr. Chair, I would then suggest that if there are changes to the population or employment that we're looking at or working towards, there would be that corresponding change to the capital. So just because if we're increasing the number of units that we're anticipating to build and we're maximizing those densities, I would fully expect that we're going to bring forward additional capital expenditures in order to service that growth.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Incredible presentation, Ms. Hall.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Riepma.
Thank you, Chair Harvey. And I think that we won't have any trouble spending 60 or allocating 60% of the funds. I think it'd be closer to 110% is likely. And we're growth is now going to pay for about 70 or 75% of growth. My question is, we have in the last couple of years had quite a considerable growth construction here in Barrie, and we've collected development charges very significantly. But before that, there was very little growth, and so as a city, we suffered as a result of it. Now we're starting to see a higher interest environment, which leads us to think that we might have a lower amount of building happening in the next year or two or three. How does your study accommodate for that? Because one of the things that we don't want to do is have a recurrence of sort of our expenses far exceeding our income.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. That's an excellent question. And so the Development Charges Act, as I mentioned during my presentation, has a very strict number of steps, or is very prescribed in terms of what we have to do in order to come up with the calculation. And through that process, we have to make adjustments for things like the available DC reserve fund balance. So that includes whether or not it's in a negative or deficit position or in a positive position. We recognize that through this process, the DC study is done in a snapshot of time. It's based on achieving forecast targets and infrastructure plans that are developed and are used to inform the DC study that we undertake every 5 or so years, right? And so through those adjustments that we do in by accounting for the available DC reserve fund balances, we do look at growth that has occurred, and we adjust our forecast if there's been an uptick in development or a decrease in development. So in a sense, we do make sure that we account for those fluctuations. It's just because we do the study updates every 5 or so years, that's the point in time in which we make those adjustments.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hamilton.
That was actually my question, so thank you. But I'll more of a comment than anything. Thank you for that presentation. It was excellent. And I must admit, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what the impact's going to be financially. So I look forward to receiving the report in June, because I think it's going to be extremely impactful for council and our decision making going forward. Just on slide 8 of the pie chart that looks at how developmental charges are distributed, just to clarify, is that based on historically how DCs were spent, or is that sort of how DCs when they're collected, that's the breakdown of where they should be contributed to?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. So that's a really great question as well. The pie chart is simply intended to show if you were to go to the counter today and pay a DC, where are the funds going to be allocated? As part of this background study, we're doing a revamp of that calculation, and so those numbers will change. But that split I was talking about having the engineered services really making up the bulk of the rate, I would expect that trend to continue as part of this update as well.
Because I think that's going to be very important for council too, as we move forward and we're making decisions in terms of how DCs are being allocated. And as you mentioned, Mayor Nettle, in previous budget, we looked at some of these DCs seem to be allocated not to new infrastructure, but actually to previous infrastructure that needed to be updated or modified. So again, I look forward to the June report because I think we're going to have a lot of decisions and conversations around this. The only other question I had is the DCs in year one, you can collect 80%. So the remaining 20% is spread over the following 4 years. Do we collect interest on that is what I think I heard you say over those 4 years?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So we're allowed to index those rates
Okay.
as they're brought forward. If there's been any sort of DC freezes on individual applications, we're allowed to collect interest on that. It's a bit of a complicated way. The report will outline some of those requirements and how those are applied as well.
Okay, thank you. That's it. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. Follow up from Mayor Nettle.
Yeah, just wanted to ask, and we've sort of been bantering this around a little bit in the mayor's office and with senior staff with regards to tax rates in newly developed areas. I know this is a little bit outside of the scope of a development charge, but let's say for a second, let's pretend we're 10 years ago and we're going to recover 90% of the costs. Is it possible through either any of DC laws or any of the finance laws to create a separate tax rate for newer areas to make up for the lost revenue?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So that is a bit, as you correctly pointed out, a bit outside of the scope of this study process. But I would suggest that, you know, any sort of revenue shortfall that we experience or things that we cannot fund through the DCs, it does have to fall through the other funding sources, which unfortunately is your property tax base or ratepayer fees as well. So whether or not there's some creativity in that, I'll leave that to a property tax expert, but that essentially the revenue shortfall has to be made up through that.
Mr. Miller, is there anything you can add to that?
Through you, Chairman Harvey, to members of committee. So it is under the Assessment Act, under the Municipal Act. So in a nutshell, I think you're asking if can you charge one area of the city higher property taxes for a service that's provided. You can do it if it's limited to that specific area. So for example, let's say the city didn't have any bus service and you wanted to provide bus services just in, let's say, the Salem lands. You can't charge, or you theoretically could charge a specific rate higher in that area for that bus service if the buses stay within the roads within the Salem lands. So it's very specific. If you were to say, can we build a rec center in an area of the city and charge that area a higher tax rate? It would be no, because those are considered a community benefit. So there are limited examples that municipalities have done, but it's specifically the area has to benefit from that service. So it's difficult to do.
Yeah, I gather that through that. It's just so ironic to me that people who live in the city of Barrie are going to be helping to pay for the homes of those who don't. It's just so incredibly backwards, and we're not. It's not getting closer. It's getting further apart.
Actually, I'm just going to chime in quick as a follow up there to Mr. Miller, talking about like the busing and stuff in the Salem area. Now, how would, let's say, the new Salem pipe that is $72 million tie into that? Would that be something that could be specifically allocated just to that new expansion within the city? Because obviously that pipe is basically dedicated to that new growth.
So through you, Councillor Harvey, it's the pipes are collected. The capital cost of that pipe is be collected and charged under Development Charges Act. Right? It's you can do an area specific charge for that area to build that capital cost of that pipe. And actually, we do have that built into our current development charge. There is a higher rate in the Salem Hewitt's lands related to higher costs. So it's not a property tax question. It's kind of how you're structuring your development charges for that, in that example of the engineered services.
Great, thank you. Anybody else with any questions? No? I just have one other question to get a little more clarity. I'll grab you again. When it comes to, like, obviously the government's talked about doing audits on reserves of all municipalities. And you also mentioned through your presentation that the reserve accounts will come into play when it comes to how this is all going to unfold. Now, in a municipality like ours, where from what I understand, in comparison to our size, we're actually fairly low in our reserves. Will that actually benefit us then? Like, how do you anticipate that this is all going to play out? Or are we still very early on where there's still a lot of unknowns?
Yes, and that's a great question, Mr. Chair. And you're getting into some of the nuances of the calculation, which is sometimes a little bit tricky to explain. But so I don't think necessarily that the city would be in a more advantageous position if you had, say, lower reserve fund balances. The reason being is that growth didn't materialize, and that's why the reserves are in the position that they are. Recognizing though that growth is clearly starting to come online, and so really where we find challenges is if municipalities aren't spending their DC reserves, or if they've been holding on to them for a particularly large project and then the project scope changes, or the project doesn't materialize and then it was earmarked, and then so now we're applying it to other projects. But through the DC regime and the prescribed process there, we account for any sort of available balances. So I don't think it's going to necessarily tip the scales in the city's favor one way or the other, but it is something that we definitely consider as part of our calculation.
Great, thank you, Councillor Hamilton.
That's okay. Just being mindful of time, I'll hold it. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great, thanks. I thank you for your presentation. Obviously, it was top of mind for everybody since there was a boatload of questions, and I'm glad we have some smart people that specialize in this to get us through this, because it is a heck of a lot of information to try and wrap your head around, especially with some of the changes that are coming forward too. So I do thank you.
That was the update from the City Hall. We will bring you the budget news as the final budget is scheduled to be passed on March date. Thank you for watching.